Welcome back on American track of Agile by Example. Here in Warsaw, it's already evening, but across the Atlantic Ocean, where our speakers are, it's afternoon. On this track, we will have two interesting presentations, so stay tuned for more Agile by Example. First of them is Karaleise. Welcome, Karaleise. Nice to have you here on virtual stage of Agile by Example.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, great. Karaleise has over 10 years of experience being a business analyst in many different industries. She helps other business analysts to grow in their role. She is also author of Business Analyst's Job Market Report, available on Amazon. In her talk, she will share her experience with using different formats, user stories, and highlights user stories best practices. So, Karaleise, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Mikhail. I really appreciate it. Hi, everyone, and welcome to my talk on how to write good user stories. We have a lot to cover today. I'm very excited to share with you some points and some takes and some practical examples of how we actually do user stories in the real world. So let me jump in right away. A little bit more about me, right? Mikhail gave a great introduction, but I want to talk a little bit more. You might hear an accent, and that's because I'm Jamaican by birth. Right now, I live in Atlanta. It looks dark behind me. That's because I'm in my basement. They are making some construction, and I don't want the noise to interfere, so I'm here down here. But it's really daylight where I am. So I'm from Jamaica. I've been working as a business analyst for a while. This is a picture of me and my daughter. We like to go hiking. She's much better at me at hiking, actually. She's the one who always says, "Come on, Mom, you can do it." You know, she's really good at that. When I'm not working on projects, I'm typically finding a waterfall somewhere. I'm attracted to water bodies, whether it's a beach or it's a waterfall. And here in Georgia, we have so many good waterfalls. So that's my weekend getaways sometimes. But my career has been as a business analyst. And that's what I spent most of my time doing. And I uncovered this role while I was working in a different role. I didn't even know that there was such a role as a business analyst. And then I was exposed to it and I was like, wow, this is great. This is the thing for me. So I've made it my career. And in those times, I've worked with several teams, agile teams, waterfall teams on building quality software. And it's really become a passion of mine. And so I'm going to be sharing with you today some of the projects I've worked on, talk a bit about business analysis and a little bit of user stories and how that works out in Agile. So one of my pet peeves is that there is no business analyst role in Agile Scrum, right? So Agile Scrum only has 3 roles: developers, product owners, and Scrum masters, but there is no role for business analysts. So that kind of hurts because we work so much with Agile teams and we're always trying to support the team, but we don't really have a role. So we need to figure out how we can solve for that. So in this session, we're going to talk about user stories, right? It's going to be all about user stories. We're going to talk about what makes a good user story and some examples from real world projects so they can see a concrete example of user story in action on a real project. So let's talk a little bit about the projects that I plan to share with you today. So there are 2 of them. One is called Action Plan Project. Now I've renamed it because I really don't have permission from the owners to talk about it. So I've kind of anonymized it a little bit just to keep it legal, right? So the Action Plan Project really is a task management feature tracking system, right? And so it's really geared towards salespeople. So salespersons are going to be using this to help them strategize how they can actually win the deal. So if you're if you're in a sales team and you're working towards winning some $1 million contract, you really have to put a strategy together and you need to have tasks. And some of these teams can have 30 people, 45 people, really huge sales teams going after really, really huge deals. How do you help them to be more successful? How do you help them strategize their planning? And that's what the Action Plan Project was about. And it was mainly for the account managers as the users. The other project was Land and Expand. So land and expand is also kind of a sales organization term, right? So you've already gotten the account, they became a customer, they've paid you money. How do you keep getting money out of them? How do you keep expanding? How do you keep upselling, cross-selling? What else can you do to get revenue out of that account? So how do you manage the ideas for growing revenue, right? That's what that project was about, targeting sales teams and how they increase the revenue. And it was also an integrated feature, just like the action plan project. Integrated means that it was sending data back and forth to CRMs and other software that would use the output from those systems. So in this discussion, we'll look at those two projects and see how user stories were used and some of the nuances of writing user stories for projects like these that are enterprise level projects. So imagine a sales team, right? Everybody crowded together, trying to come up with a strategy for how they're going to win this deal. They have the sales funnel, they're getting leads in, they're trying to figure out how these leads can convert into actual prospects and qualify those leads. So part of the whole sales process is how do you make sure that this is a person who is likely to buy, or a business that's likely to buy whatever it is that you're selling. And then once you get them to buy, how do you keep growing the revenue? Like, what do you do? How do you sell more things to them, keep them paying you more? Because you really have to expand the account and keep revenue generated from that account that you got already landed. So those are the projects, right? We're going to come back to them. Right now, we're going to talk a little bit about the user stories, and then we're going to switch into context of from those projects, how did we write user stories to solve for some of the problems that we encountered with those projects, right? So all about user stories. Who's excited? Right? Isn't user stories one of those things that you're like, wow, I can't wait to go do some user stories, right? Or is it just me? Am I the only person excited about user stories? There you go. Mikhail's putting his hand up. Awesome, awesome. And I'm sure there are others that I can't see who are also putting their hand up. All right, so we'll jump into this. What is a user story? Now, the term keeps floating around and people have different definitions of it, but actually user stories can be accredited back to Kent Beck as a part of the extreme programming methodology, right? So before the Agile brought all of these together, you had individual Agile methodologies, and user story was one of those from XP programming that was very useful. They would write it on a card and they would discuss it. It was something to be used for discussion. And if they didn't find the user story to be valuable, they could just tear it up and throw it away. It was very disposable, right? That's why it's on a card. So that's kind of where it came from. People think it comes from Scrum because it's so popular with Scrum, but really it came from XP programming or extreme programming. So it's a conversation starter, right? The point of the user story is to have discussions. It's to talk about it. It's to get the team aligned and thinking through this one problem that's on the user story and how we can actually add value to the user with whatever we're coming up with as solutions. It's small chunks of functionality that provide benefit to the user. So if there is no benefit to the user or the customer, then you're really not writing a user story at that point, right? So while user personas highlight who your users are, sorry, I'm fixing my computer here. User stories examine what they do, right? So that's some of the definitions of user stories. I'm sure you have heard a lot of this already. So what makes a user story good? Like, what makes a good user story? So good user stories are talked about, not written, right? So we have to move away from this concept of writing user stories, even though my talk is titled How to Write. Really, it's really how to talk about user stories, how to have discussions about user stories, how to bring the team together to discuss what the user story is. It's really the one thing that helps us to focus on that discussion, and that should be talking around the user story. So it's really a discussion piece as opposed to a written piece. So here are some other things about user story. What makes it good? Well, it's discussed with the team. That's the first thing, right? So user story has to be talked about. If you just write your user story and throw it over the wall and say, okay, the user story is done, then you're doing something wrong. You should be talking about it, you should be having discussion. I can't emphasize that enough, because I've seen in many cases where we get into the mindset of writing so much and then we end up not meeting not solving the problem because we wrote it and we didn't talk about it. When you talk about something, you form this picture, right? So imagine I go to your house and you have pictures on your walls. I might just see a picture of you, I don't know, skating or something. To me, it's just a picture. But because you lived it, right? You had the discussions around it. You remembered it. You can talk more about it, like where you got the skateboard, where you were when that happened, where your mom was, who was taking the picture or something like that. You have a better understanding because you just, there was a memory there. So when you have discussions and you talk about user stories, you form that picture in the heads of your team. And so it's much more likely for them to make good decisions because they fully understand what the user story is supposed to accomplish. So the user story has to focus on the user, right? Well, it says user story. So obviously the user has to be, set front and center. So you have to be able to focus on the user, not the manager, not the system. Like the one thing that you're focusing on with the user story is the user. It must be visible to the team. What does that mean? That means that you're not writing it and putting it in a folder on some file or some drive somewhere that nobody else can see. That used to happen a lot, actually, back in the day for Waterfall. We used to work in this process called Rational Unified Process, RUP, back in the day. And there sometimes you'd have these requirements that was like tucked away and nobody could see them. So with the user story, it's visible. And most of us use Jira, so you can see the entire backlog. You can see all the user stories and everybody can get to see it. The user story has to be testable, right? So it has a testable acceptance criteria. And we'll talk more about the acceptance criteria and what it is and what it is not. But you need to be able to test the user story. It's also short and it's concise. And that's why we like to use the images of a sticky note for the user story, because it means that you can only put so much on there, right? It's not this long epistle. It's not a lot of stories. It's not paragraph upon paragraph. It's really just this short, concise thing that you're focusing on in each moment of time. So you're not spending hours and hours discussing a very, very long user story. It focuses on the problem to solve and not the feature to build, right? So you really want to avoid becoming a feature factory where you're just brainstorming features, implementing features, shipping features, brainstorming features, implementing features, shipping features. So you become a feature factory. With the user story, you should be focusing on the problem that you're solving. What's the benefit that you're giving to this user? What's the problem you're solving, so that you can always produce software that will solve problems and people will be more willing to use your software when it's solving their problem, right? The user story should be removed if it's no longer valuable. So this is one that I even get stuck on, where I write a user story. We had discussions, we talked about it, and then the product owner says, we can't do this anymore, we take it out. And we have it in the backlog, and then something else happens and it stays in the backlog and it's been there for a year and nobody removes it. People are afraid to delete user stories because you just don't want to lose your work. It might come back one day. But you should be able to remove a user story that's no longer valuable. Delete it, get rid of it, because the point of having it on paper at the time was so that you could tear the paper up and throw it away. Now that we have it in Jira, we just want to keep it and become user story hoarders. But we should be willing to remove things that are no longer valuable. So we know the typical way that people explain user stories with the INVEST acronym. So it's independent. The story does not depend on any other user story. We'll talk more about that in a minute. It's negotiable. The story acts as a conversation. We talked about that just now, where it's not a final contract. So before, when you used to have waterfall projects, the requirement was final. It's like, this is the requirement and you dare not change the requirement, right? So they gave you a requirement and that was it. But with the user story, it's intended for you to keep evolving and changing and talking about it and refining it, right? So it's not a final requirement in the way that we used to think of requirements. It's also valuable, so it has to represent some value to the user, so that you know that when you implement this, there's some user who's going to benefit. It's not just benefiting the system or benefiting some manager somewhere, but it's really benefiting the end customers and the end users. It's estimatable. So the story has enough concrete detail for you to make an estimate for the team to be able to estimate it. Sometimes user stories that I've seen in the past may be too small. You can't really estimate it, or too big. It's like, you have to break this up. It's way too big. But the user story ideal size should be small enough for you to be able to estimate it, but valuable enough that it gives some value to the user. And that dovetails into the other one, which is small. It has to fit on that little, post-it note. That means you're not writing paragraphs upon paragraphs, because it's too hard for anyone to estimate or to really understand and have a conversation around if it's too big. And then it must be testable. So you have to be able to test it. If you've written a user story that cannot be tested, then how can you validate it's meeting the acceptance criteria, right? So you have to be able to get acceptance criteria out of it that you can test. So that's the invest: independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, small, and testable, which I'm sure most of you would have met. But user stories are not that simple, right? We don't just say this acronym and we're done. There's a lot of nuances with each of these things, and these are the nuances. So when it says it's independent, I have yet to see a project that has all of its user stories independent. There's usually some dependencies. As a matter of fact, in Jira, if you're using Jira for your user stories, there is a dependency field where you can pick how it's dependent. Is it a blocker? Is it related? Is it causing something? So there are dependencies in your user stories. So when it says it's independent, it doesn't mean that there is no dependency. What it means is you're going to remove the unnecessary dependencies, and you're going to attempt to write user stories that are not completely dependent on each other. So as far as you can decouple them, the better. The more decoupled they are, the better. It doesn't mean that you won't end up with a project that has one or two user stories dependent. All right. The other one is that it's negotiable. So, except when it's in the sprint, because oftentimes we start the sprint and we end the sprint and we make sure that the sprint is actually finalized, right? And we don't want to add no stories in the sprint. So it's negotiable, but the negotiation needs to happen before the sprint starts, right? Valuable. Even backend stories need to be valuable to the user. So you have to, if you're even writing backend stories, maybe API stories, maybe stories that are just to do some backend thing, at some point, all of this needs to be some benefit to the user. So you have to make sure that you can see how the user benefits in the long run. Estimatable, except for spike stories, right? So as you know, spike stories are the ones that you can't estimate because you may not have the information, you just don't know how to do something. So you write a spike story in order for you to go and investigate and figure out how to do that, and it's time boxed, right? So you need to put it within a time box. Also, it's small. So the user story is small, but not too small. If you make it too small, then there's no value, and they tell you to add more things to the story so they can have it in the sprint and be able to estimate it properly. And testable, needs to have acceptance criteria that can be tested. Okay. All right, so good user stories have acceptance criteria, which is a confirmation of the agreements that was discussed when you talked about the story. Okay, so that's where the acceptance criteria comes in. So now that we've talked about what makes a good user story, then what makes a bad user story? Well, the opposite, right? The opposite would be true. So a bad user story is one that's not discussed. It's where you just wrote the story and it's in some status and you put it into the sprint and that's it. Maybe you talk about it in the sprint planning, but you didn't have the discussion enough to make sure that the team fully understands it. It's just kind of, okay, we're doing this and that's it. So we don't want to do that. We want to have full discussion so that everybody forms a picture of what the user story is supposed to be doing and can tease out any of the nuances that might be in there. If the user story prescribes technology, so you're telling people to use JSON or it's HTML5 or whatever the technology is, that should not be a part of your user story. Your user story should be agnostic of the technology. It should really be about the what's, and it shouldn't be too much about how they're doing it. If it dictates UI elements, so if you start talking about a checkbox versus a radio button versus any other UI element, then you're writing a bad user story because it really shouldn't be dependent on that. One of the reasons is if the UI changes, you shouldn't have to go change your user story, right? So if they change it from a checkbox to a radio button, then now you have to go update your story. You shouldn't have that coupling, right? It should really be decoupled. It focuses on the feature, not the problem. So if your user story is focusing on the feature and not how it's solving the problem, then you've gone on the wrong path, right? Come back, you can do it, right? Focus on the problem, not on the feature. If you write user stories as tasks to execute, so it's a list of tasks, do this, do this, do this, then that is not really what the user story is intended to do. It's, again, the value to the user. If you're writing user stories for bugs and for tech debt, now this is one that we have a lot of discussions about in the business analyst community, because not everything in your backlog has to be a user story or written in a user story format. As a user, I want this bug to be fixed so that I can use the system, for example, right? That's a bad example. But the point is, bugs, for example, don't have to be written in a user story format or technical debt. If your user story is huge, like there is like lines and lines and lines, and you're really off, you've gone off the rails when it comes to user stories. And part of the challenge is that Jira, which is what most of us use, doesn't really enforce the formatting for a user story. Yes, you can create a template in Jira and use it, but it doesn't mean that you have to. It's really just a text box, and you can go in there and put whatever you like, right? That doesn't mean you should put whatever you like. You should try to stick to the format that is recommended for a user story and your acceptance criteria. And if you write a user story that cannot be tested, like there is no way you can test this thing. It's something in the back end that nobody has a way to test. How do you validate that the user story is working? How do you demo this? How do you test it? So if the user story cannot be tested, then you definitely know that you have a problem and you need to work on fixing them. All right. So this is the structure that most of you know. And actually this one that came from Richard Kaporowski from Harvard University. So his structure is, here's the title of the user story. And then the format that we all know. As a user, I want so that, right? So as a user, I want this feature so I can have that benefit. And then you can put your additional details. We typically put that under notes or some additional details that you'd want the developers to know. And then you have your acceptance criteria. You could put the details before or below the acceptance criteria. It shouldn't matter. So that's what we have. But this is happening after you've had discussions. This is happening after you've talked about it. This is just putting it into a format that they can go refer to. But this isn't it, right? You have to talk about it first, agree on it, have it in your sprint planning or your grooming, whatever session you do. And then once the team has agreed on it, this is how you will write it down so that we can know when it's done and have it for testing. So using user stories in the real world project. So going back to the projects that we talked about before and making sure that we understand how to use user stories in those projects. Mikhail, I have to quickly get my charger because I think my battery might be dying. I'll mute for 1 second and go check it. I'm sorry. Sorry, guys. Just want to make sure I don't get cut off. Be right back.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Karaleise, for now. And we are waiting for you to come back to us. This is interesting speech, and we have some questions, but I think I will leave them to the very end, and then we came with those questions. But if you have any more questions, please put them in the chat in main pink yellow on Slack, so we can ask the question in the end. Oh, I hope Karaleise will join us soon. Waiting for her. If you find interesting what Karaleise is talking about, you can find her in very different places because she is very active in social media. So you can find her on YouTube channel, on Spotify. You can find her page on Facebook. So after the talk, you can follow those materials. Okay, but
thank you. I just wanted to make sure we didn't get cut off. So thank you so much, Mikhail. So let's jump into user stories in the real world projects, okay? So we talked earlier about the action plan project. So this was to help sales teams manage the task needed to win the deal. So they're going up against this deal against other people who are trying to compete for the deal. They want to win. How do we help them do that? So some of the problems that we uncovered with that project was only one user could edit in the action plan at a time. So you'll be in there in a room, let's say in a conference room, and there's a task that comes up from the discussion, and you got to say, hey, Mikal, can you come out? Because I need to go in. And Mikal says, okay, Anna, you got to, are you done yet? So the users would complain that the collaboration was not good because now you have to organize who is in at which time in order for you to put your task. And that was a problem. So that was impeding their brainstorming process, right? And then if you exit without clicking on the save button, you would lose all your changes, all the tasks, all the stuff that you came up with would be gone. And we all know that's not a good user experience. So the two solutions that we came up with for this problem was to user capability and then to also auto-save, right? It seems very generic now because we all use these auto-save software, but it was not something that we had in our tool and was causing lots of problems with our users. So when we did our brainstorming session, we talked about this. We sat together, we talked about it. We came up with some questions that we needed to answer, which was how to let users know who's editing at the time, right? How to ensure you don't override each other when you're in the action plan. How to prevent deleting someone else who is editing. And by the way, this plan was like a task list. I don't have a screenshot here, but it's like a task list, but it has milestones and dependencies. So every task works towards a goal or an objective, and every objective works towards a goal. So it's a tree structure. And so you are helping the sales team to get to their ultimate goal of winning the deal, but they needed to do all these little tasks to get to this objective, and then from that objective to the goal. So there was interdependencies that you had to consider. And so somebody could be working on a task down here and somebody else working on a goal up here. And then if you delete the goal, then all the children would be deleted because it's a parent-child relationship. So there was many complexities, very complex software that we were working with. How to handle connections and timeout, right? How to make sure that the tasks that you are creating in this software could be integrated with your CRM because you wanted to make sure that both of them were in sync. So those are some of the challenges that we faced when we tried to solve for the problem of multi-user and also auto-saving. So we created a lot of user stories, right, to solve for these and many others. And so I'll just share with you a few of them and some of the nuances that came out of some of these user stories. So this is an example of one of the user stories that I wrote, which was prevent the user from deleting the action plan if it has been edited by another user. So now we're allowing two people to be in the same action plan. How do you make sure they don't override each other and edit each other? So mainly our title of the user story explains what the user story does, right? So it normally starts with a verb and it explains the action that's been taken on the point of the user story. And then we have our user story section, which just has the format that we're all used to. And then we have our acceptance criteria. Excuse me. So the acceptance criteria, in this case, I have it in Jerkin format. So we're doing behavioral BDD, behavioral design, behavioral driven design. So given that I am on the action plan, so I start, where are you now? We're here, we're on the action plan. When I do this action, then the system makes this response. When I do this, the system does this. So when I'm editing a task, then another user cannot delete the parent of the task I'm editing. And in this case, when I write all of these user stories, we had a kind of a system. Everybody does it differently. Again, you own your methodology, right? You don't rent it. So when we decide to do Agile, we tweak it to match our environment. So what we had them doing was, once you have tested the user story, then you would mark it as done. But there were cases where they would test user stories and there might be a acceptance criteria that wasn't tested. And so it caused some issues. So we would go back and say, okay, for every acceptance criteria, we want you to put the word verified to say that you actually verified this actual line. So that's where these come from. So this was put in by QA afterwards. I know some people don't like QA, kind of writing where we write the acceptance criteria, but in our case, it worked, right? And we did what worked. So we would write the user story, they would develop it, and then QA would come behind and test it. And for each line that they tested that was verified, they would put it in there. So that's how we were doing it. Yeah, so this is an example of one of the stories. Here's another example. This was one for the action plan, saving the row on exit. So after our discussions, we decided that you can't, we would auto save, not for every stroke of your key, but when you leave a row, because it was almost like a table format. So when you exit the row, then we save the entire action plan. That would help us with performance and help us make sure the users knew that their changes were being saved. So here's another example. So we have the title being with a verb and explains what the user story does. That way you can easily identify it in the backlog. And when you open it, you should know what it's supposed to be doing, right? It should match. And so we write, as a user, I want to auto save my action plan whenever I exit a row so that my changes can be saved without having to click the save button. So in this user story, we remove the save button and we let the system automatically keep saving as the changes were being made. In this case, one of the acceptance criteria failed. So we have this system where when the acceptance criteria fails, they put failed, right? And they put the date that it was tested, and they typically create a bug. And sometimes we have them put the bug in the comments of Jira, or they may put it in line, as you see here, that this acceptance criteria failed. This is the bug that covers it. And when that bug is done, then they would mark this. I think they would mark it as done here, or they'll put it on hold until the bug is fixed or something like that. So there, we use these little conventions to indicate when something goes right or wrong with the user story as you're building it. Here's another one. So in this one, we had to create a spike story. So what happened was they needed to do this feature. We didn't want them to be displaced. So everybody's in there, but because of how the system is and the lines and the tables, when you were moving in between them and somebody has joined, it just jumped and it just looked kind of buggy, right? So we needed to find a way to solve that, but nobody really had the answer. Nobody knew what was the best thing. So we created a spike story, and the spike story would help them to investigate how to solve the problem. And we gave it a time box of 2 days. And then that result of the spike story would inform the estimation of the original story, right? Mikhail, how are we on time? Are we good?
Yes, we have another 15 minutes left.
Okay. All right, so I'll just keep going until we get to the QA section. So here's another project. This one is the Land and Expand project, which is what we talked about earlier, where you've gotten the account, right? They bought your software, bought your product, and now you need to find something else to sell them. Like, how do you keep having them give you money? That's the point of having a business, right? How do you keep making money out of this account? That's the whole point of expanding. So landing it was one thing. Now you got to expand. So the problems with this one that we're trying to solve for was that the system was only handling accounts and opportunities. So if you're into the sales world at all, you know that an opportunity is a qualified, almost like a qualified lead. I might be saying it wrong here because I'm not a sales, expert, but it's like you qualified the lead and you know that there's a potential for this person to become a customer, right? You've done all of your vetting, you've asked the right questions, you know they have a need, you've done some qualification to confirm that they could be a customer, right? So you handle the accounts that you've already landed one way, but you handle the opportunities a different way, for sure. So once you've landed the account and they've bought from you the first time, you may have new ideas as to how to keep getting the revenue out of them, what else you could sell them, the cross-sells, the upsells, and so on. But those ideas were being held in the heads of the account manager and the sales team, mainly because if they were to put it in their CRM, then all of a sudden it becomes exposed, everybody's looking at it, it becomes a part of a pipeline, you have to explain why you didn't make the sale if you didn't make the sale. So there's all kinds of reporting happening if you put it in your CRM or in any other system. So what the salespeople would do is they would have it in their Excel sheets or in their emails or in some document, and they would not put it in their CRM or other tool until they have validated that the idea is actually good. So you have an idea to sell them a new product, but you don't want to tell anyone because if you tell them, then they're going to put it on their reports and know you're going to be accountable. So they didn't want to do that. But they had a real problem because they had good ideas to grow revenue. And when their manager would ask them, what are you doing about this account? How will you grow revenue in this account? They can't really remember all the ideas that they have, or there isn't a good way to show that they're working towards it. So they were in a bind. So we decided that we wanted to provide them an area where they can work on their ideas. They can nurture their ideas without having all of this eyes on it and all of this, expectation that it's going to become profit, right? It's going to become a part of the pipeline. So we gave them this safe space, and whenever they finished nurturing it, then they could convert it to an actual opportunity in Salesforce or any other CRM. And that way they had more control over when the idea, became an opportunity. So the solution was to provide a feature to help them manage their ideas to grow the revenue and help them do all the activities, but mainly a task-based system that said, okay, now you have these ideas, here's what you do first, second, and third, and they could put their tasks in and work towards determining if the idea was actually valid. So here's some problems that we uncovered as we had the discussions around this. How do you help users see what stage their idea is in? It could be just, I came up with the idea, or I've talked to someone and they've confirmed that they're interested in it. Maybe somebody says they have a project that's funded and we are about to to look for vendors, and they're like, this is great. Now they can try to jump on that opportunity, not an opportunity yet, but potential opportunity. So how do you help them with that? How do you help users convert the idea? So once they have done all the work on the idea, you don't really want them to have to do the same thing again in another system, right? You want to be able to just transfer that information where it belongs and not have them do rekeying. And then how do you help users see at a glance how much revenue they have in an account? So what salespeople love is to see how much money can I make from this account, right? Easily, without knowing, without going through all of the steps of, qualifying opportunities. So those were the problems we were solving for. Here's an example of just some of the user stories. This one is just random user stories I pulled from the project. This is one where we were trying to clone or copy the idea so that you don't have to redo them. So if you had an idea that didn't work out and the client said they're not interested, and then they came back later and said, okay, we are interested, how do you just copy that information to a new one without having to do it all over again? So the same thing where you have your user story sentence and you also have your title being very descriptive and using a verb, right? So you have your acceptance criteria. In this case, though, what happened was midway in the sprint, there was a change, right? So the requirement kind of changed and they wanted to do something different. How do you handle that? How do you update your user story while they're already in development? Well, what we try to do, one of the conventions that we implemented was putting in bracket the words change and the date, because when we would go in and change it and there was nothing to call it out, the developer sometimes didn't notice that there was a change. So he read the user story at the beginning and he estimated it and he went off to build it. He doesn't really come back and check it every day. Sometimes we put comments and that helps, but we found that if we put that there was a change and the date, it just brought it. When you look at the story, for some reason, it brings their attention to that line and they realize that they need to make that change. So that is how we handle changes during the sprint, which is something we try to minimize because we really don't want to be disrupting the sprint. But there are those odd cases where the developer is developing it now and it's best for him to change it now than to do it afterwards, right? So we try to minimize changes, but in the event that you have to, this is something that we did that we found that worked, that maybe you guys can try as well. Here's another example where we had some, I think it's the same story actually, but we had some more changes, right? And then we put some notes for the QA. So you can put your notes before or after, but in this case, we wanted them to specially test something in a specific way. And so we put that note in there. Now we can have that during the conversation, but sometimes if you put it in the story, just make sure it happens. All right, so we're at the end here. We know we need to leave some time for questions. So what did we discuss, right? We talked about what makes a good user story. We talked about what makes a bad user story. And then we just talked about how to write user stories on real world projects. And I showed you some examples of stories that we've written for 2 real world projects that are out there now in production. So I'm gonna leave some time for some questions. Thank you all very much. I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion, and I definitely enjoyed giving it. So without further ado, let's take some questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karaleise, for this speech. It was very interesting, and it brings a lot of questions from our audience. So, other further ado, let's go to those questions. First of all, you mentioned about throwing away user stories, and this is very important. But I suppose it is happened not too often. How often have you seen stories thrown away, and what should we do to force people to do so?
I don't see it happening often, which is probably the problem, right? I've seen teams backlog is so huge, and you're like, when are we ever going to get to these stories? And nobody wants to throw them away. Nobody wants to make the call that, okay, we're just not going to get to these. So you end up with a huge backlog. But I've found that sometimes when you're having a discussion and it comes out that the story is no longer relevant, the use case is no longer there, the client no longer wants it, that people are still hesitant. And I would just encourage people to delete the story if you don't think you're going to use it. Maybe you don't delete it right away. Maybe you wait a week to see if anybody changes their mind. But the hoarding of user stories, just keeping them in the backlog forever, is not a good approach to managing your backlog or to keeping user stories. So I would encourage people to start deleting the ones that they're not using and they know they're not going to get to for a long time. Or you could, I think you could even archive it or move it to a different project, if that makes sense, if you're really hesitant. But having all of these stories without any time frame as to when you're going to get to them is not good. I myself am taking that advice, so.
Yeah. Do you often throw away user stories?
I don't often, because we make sure we're very thoughtful as to when we put a user story in the backlog. So we have discussions up front before we actually create the user stories and make sure it is something that we actually want to do. That way we don't create this this backlog that's not going to be built soon. So I'm very thoughtful about that, and I work with product owners and product managers who are also thoughtful. But there are the occasions where we say, okay, we're not going to do this, let's get rid of it. So not very often, but it does happen.
Yeah, and it's very important in my opinion. Okay, another question. You said that good user story needs to be discussed. Who should it be discussed and with and when?
So it's typically the Scrum team if you're doing Agile Scrum. So you really want the user story to be something the whole team discusses, right? The developers are in there, the product owners are in there, yourself, because you want to make sure the team understands what you're trying to build and what you're working towards for your sprint goal. So I would encourage everybody in the Scrum team to be discussing the user stories to make sure the whole team understands what we're building. So that could be your QA, your developers, the Scrum Masters in there. If you have a business analyst, that person's in there too. Obviously, product owner. So the whole team should be discussing the user story.
Okay, great. How do you approach backend and frontend stories? With one story or split? There is few questions about splitting user stories.
Yeah, so back-end teams and front-end teams is really a challenge, especially if they're offshore teams. I actually did a video just now on offshore teams. It depends on the type of project you're working on. Typically, if you have a separate team, you'd have separate stories, but there might be dependencies between them that you'd have to put that relationship in the Jira so they can see, okay, this one is waiting on this, and this one is, there's much more coordination you have to do. But I would still encourage us to, if you have separate teams, it might make sense to have separate stories so that they can each work on them individually without that much waiting time for the other person to be done.
Okay. And another question is about writing acceptance criteria. I think there is a lot of discussion with this topic, And I heard it many times that teams do not want to write user acceptance criteria, but they think the product owner should do this for them. Who should write acceptance criteria? Product owner? The whole team? The whole Scrum team?
I think, and I know there's lots of discussion on this, and there's varying opinions, and everybody feels very justified in their opinion. So I'm just going to share mine. I think that the acceptance criteria should be written by the product owner, or if you have a business analyst, it should be written by the business analyst. That doesn't mean that they come up with it by themselves. So the whole team is having a discussion. The whole team is talking about the user story. The whole team has agreed as to what are the acceptance criteria. And then somebody has to be responsible for documenting that and putting that in the user story so that we can build it. But I think it has to follow the discussion, right? It shouldn't be somebody in silo writing these acceptance criteria and then somebody else picking it up and doing it. It has to be part of the collaboration, the conversation. But at the end of the day, I think the product owner writes it, puts it in writing. And if you have a business analyst on the team, and I'm always advocating for business analysts because I think we bring a lot of value, right, to the agile teams, and many companies don't have that role. But if you do have the role, then that's the person responsible for it. If you don't have the role, then it should be in my opinion, it should be the product owner that writes it. I don't like developers writing acceptance criteria because I feel like their focus is on software and building it, right? And we've had a discussion, they understand it, but there is a style to writing the acceptance criteria that makes it very clear, very to the point, very testable. And so I think that skill lies with the product owner or the business analyst more than it does with the developers. Developers are great at writing the code and making sure it's working well, but I think the acceptance criteria should be the realm of the product owner.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I very like the sentence you said during the presentation that first of all, we should discuss user story and then write them.
Yes.
So this is, I think, the key. Okay, another question, can user story contain UI direction or technical decision after refinement with the team?
So this is another one that's controversial, right? I don't advocate that we put technical requirements or UI elements in your user stories. I think if you have UI elements, then those should be, maybe you have a style guide or you have patterns that you follow, that should be documented somewhere else. And maybe you link to that in the notes of your user story to say, okay, follow this, style guide and the link to it. Or you may attach the screenshot of your design, or if you're using like a Figma or a Zeppelin, then you can have the apps in Jira and that can pull in the design so that you can reference the design or reference the design pattern, but not have it as a part of your acceptance criteria for a user story. The reason this is dangerous is because when the designs change, which they sometimes do, and it might be small nuances. They may change the color. They may change, it's not on the left, it's on the right. You don't want to have to constantly be updating your user story because of a slight UI element change. It really is too minute for a user story. It should be something you reference and not something you actually put as acceptance criteria. Now, when it comes to technical requirements, I think those should be subtasks, right? You can create them as tasks that are just like a dev-only thing that you put in there, but it shouldn't be a part of your user story acceptance criteria. Remember, the user story is value to the end user, right? And these are the things we're going to test to make sure we provide that value. So I think if it's anything technical, then that goes into a task that's attached to the story to say these are the technical things we have to do to accomplish the story. But the user story itself and its acceptance criteria is really focused on the value and how you're testing for that value to the user.
Yeah, right. And the last question till the time box ends, it's about Spike. How precise acceptance criteria should have technical or functional Spike?
So with your Spike story, the reason it's a Spike is because you really don't know much about it, right? You have to go research it. You have to go figure out, okay, how do we do this? So it can't be very technically very specific, right? You're gonna just give direction as to what they should be researching, what they should be finding out, what they should be testing. Maybe they're coming up with a prototype. It could be any of those things, but it doesn't have to be very defined, because the idea is that they're going to go do the research, they're going to come back and present the results, and that's going to inform how you actually estimate the actual story. So the spike story isn't an actual user story in a sense. It's more of, here's what I want you to go research during this time, and let me know what you find from there, and we'll make a decision based on that that result. So it shouldn't be very exact. And I have an example in the presentation.
Yeah, okay, but in your practice, do you put acceptance criteria in Spike?
I typically, I do, but it's very generic, right? It's more like, at the end of this Spike story, I need a decision on if we're going to do it this way or that way. And we need a presentation of what you found, right? So it's a very generic acceptance criteria, just to give the developer or whoever the direction as to what is the result when you're done doing your research. So yes, I do use it, but I use it very, very generic and very high level.
So thank you, Karaleise. It was very nice to meet you here. There are few questions we didn't manage to answer. So if you have more questions, so join Karaleise to the Slack channel dedicated to her talk. She promised to stay there and ask the questions. So thank you very much. As I said before, Karaleise is very active on social network, so you can find many materials about her job on YouTube, on Spotify, on Facebook, and also on her own website, karaleise.com. So please join and look at those materials.